Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, burnout and balance coach and wellness expert, and you're listening to Bite Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite Size Balance. Hello, everybody. I am Wendy McCallum, your host. I'm a burnout and balance coach, and I am so excited for today's guest. I have Annie Grace with me today. Welcome, Annie.
Oh, thanks, Wendy. It's great to be here.
I am just so excited you're here, Annie. I'm going to tell everybody a little bit about you. Some of the people who are listening to this podcast are really familiar with you, and others probably it'll be the first time they've been introduced to you. So Annie is the author of a book called This Naked Mind, which is the book that really changed my life. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have her on the podcast. She is also the author of The Alcohol Experiment, a 30-day alcohol-free challenge to interrupt your habits and help you take control. And most recently, the editor of a third publication, which is called 48 True Stories of Finding Freedom from Alcohol, which is just such an inspirational collection of stories. Fun fact about Annie, she grew up in Aspen, Colorado in a one-room log cabin without running water or electricity. And then having discovered a passion for marketing, Annie earned a master's of science in marketing and dove into corporate life. As the youngest vice president in a multinational company at the age of 26, her drinking career began in earnest. At age 35, in a global C-level marketing role, Annie was responsible for marketing in 28 countries, and she was drinking almost 2 bottles of wine a night. Knowing she needed a change, but unwilling to submit to a life of deprivation and stigma, Annie Grace embarked on a journey to painlessly gain control of alcohol. And for her, that process resulted in no longer wanting to drink. Never happier, she left her executive role to write and share this naked mind with the world. Thank God, Annie. In her free time, she loves to ski and travel and enjoy her beautiful family. Annie lives with her husband and 3 children and is coming to us today from Colorado. Welcome, Annie.
Oh, such cold Colorado. We're like at -2 degrees.
I know. Fahrenheit. Did you guys get snow? I heard you were getting a snowstorm.
Yeah, lots of snow, which is good because we've had wildfires. So happy about the
snow. Well, listen, I think you might know this, but you are like my dream guest, and I'm just so delighted to have you here. I'm actually fanning out. I sent an email to my friend before this podcast, and I said, I don't know what this weird feeling is, but I think it might be nerves because I just don't really get nervous very much anymore. And today I've been just so excited in anticipation of having this conversation with you. So not only are you my dream guest, but my listeners are not going to know this. You are the reason why I have a podcast. I did the certification program with This Naked Mind this year, which was the best decision I've ever made. Added a new certification to my roster as a coach. And, it was amazing because it offered me this really great methodology that I can use with my clients and just help more people. But it also did this amazing thing that I think I've been just waiting to have happen to me for years, which is you as my mentor pushed me out of my comfort zone and you gave me the courage to take some risks. And this podcast is one of those risks. So thanks for the podcast, Annie.
Yay. I'm so glad. And I'll just say too, Wendy, that, you have really, I think, up-leveled the group as a whole. I mean, you've brought you just do what you say you're going to do, and you just push yourself more than anything. I mean, anybody can say, okay, I think you should do that, but you actually do the things. And so it's such a gift to like the relationship is mutually beneficial. And I think you just push the whole group as well by just leaning into the places you're uncomfortable. So it's awesome to see.
Oh, thank you, Annie. That's really sweet. I go on and on about how much This Naked Mind has changed my life. And I'm really excited to have you tell people some more about it. And I would love it if we could just start, Annie, with you kind of telling your story of how you got to the place where you wrote This Naked Mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So I didn't drink a ton of alcohol I had some wild days in high school, and then pretty much by college, I was like, well, I'm kind of done with that. And I didn't drink barely anything in college, very, very rarely, very much, just chose other things. I got married and my husband and I moved to New York City. And I remember my first day on the job in New York City, I was told like we had to go out for happy hour. You're the new girl. We have to take you out for drinks. I was like, okay, you know, no big deal. I didn't have any cautionary tales really around alcohol. It was just sort of like something that, I don't know, I just didn't really do a lot of. And so we went out and they're like, what do you want to drink? And it was New York City. I'm this Colorado girl, small town. I was like, I don't know, but I'd watched Sex in the City. So I was like, okay, I know they order Cosmos, so I'll order a Cosmo, which was really funny because it's not actually what most of the people working in New York City were ordering. But anyway, they're like, okay. So anyway, I had a Cosmo and I remember getting the bill for it and it was $25. And I just thought, well, this is silly. Not going to do this again. And it's the first day out, so they bought me my Cosmo, but I was like, I'm not doing that. And I think it was probably close to 6 or 8 months later where I had been promoted and I was working for a company that was headquartered in the UK. And so our big bosses would come over from the UK and they would be working in the office during the day. And then whenever they were in town, everybody was going out at night. And I wouldn't come because I was just didn't, it just wasn't even on my radar. And my boss took me aside and he's like, hey, Annie, why aren't you coming out to happy hour? And I was like, oh, I don't know. I don't really drink. He's like, oh gosh, girl, it's not about the drinking. It's about, you know, this is where the deals are done. This is kind of like the golf course for business. This is where you showcase your ideas. We're all too busy during the day. And so I'm pretty methodical as a person. And I knew I didn't want to be the person like, you know, dancing on the table or tipsy in the corner. So I had a method and I was like, okay, I'm coming, went to happy hour. I drink my glass of wine and then my glass of water and like did that. And eventually if I ever felt myself getting too tipsy, I would go to the bathroom to throw up the last glass of wine just so that I could keep up with all these people who are, you know, at least 10 years older than me, mostly men. And so it went. Fast forward 10 years and I find myself promoted multiple times. I was now a head of marketing globally for this company and traveling internationally every other week, often to 2 or 3 countries at a time. And I was drinking 2 bottles of wine every single night, at least. And I like different things would happen where I would stop buying bottles because it was just mentally painful for me to have to open that second bottle. So I started drinking boxed wine, which, you know, holds 4 bottles in a box. And we'd go through one of those boxes like in just a few days. And it started showing up in my life. Like I remember a time when my son, he was probably 6 at the time, and he came over and I asked him to sit on my lap and he's like, no, mom, your teeth are purple and you smell bad. And just these little moments where I was like, huh, this is weird. But I was so together, such a type A, together, successful. Every other part of my life just, you know, felt like it was ticking along. Sure, things were hard, but at that point, I really saw alcohol as kind of the duct tape that was keeping my whole life together. Definitely not the enemy. I would have considered it like one of my best friends. And it was the thing that made me good at networking and made me good at sales and made me loosen up enough to, you know, have the hard conversations and deal with the stress and keep it all together and more present for my kids and like this never ending list of benefits. But eventually, like the tables kind of turned and I started to see parts of it that I didn't like that were darker. And I did what anybody would do. And I said, okay, fine, you know, I'll just drink less. No big deal. I know what I'm doing. I'm in control. And so I'd make myself these little rules, like no drinking till Thursday or Friday night. And I'd break them. I could keep them for a week or 2, but then I'd break them, or I'd be like, okay, I'm going to take, you know, at least a few days off a week of drinking. And I'd break that rule, or I'm only going to drink 2 glasses of wine, and I'd break that rule. And it wasn't that I couldn't keep the rules, because I could, but whenever I did, I felt deprived and miserable. And so I found myself in this rock and a hard place of really knowing I needed to drink less, but whenever I did, feeling like, what's the point? Like, what's the point of even going out if I can't have a drink? And it was very confusing. I entered a really kind of dark space of losing a lot of trust in myself, because I'm like, I don't get it. I am like, I know what I want. I'm driven. I'm in control in all of these areas of my life. Like, I'm very methodical. I'm very pragmatic. I'm very intentional. But here was this one thing that I couldn't be intentional around, or if I was intentional, it was causing me all sorts of emotional pain. So even when I wasn't drinking, I was thinking about drinking or feeling bad for myself or feeling sorry for myself. And so one day I was actually coming back from London from a week-long business trip. I'd been over there, and of course it was super boozy, as every single one was. And I woke up in the morning, I had to get on an early flight, walked into the restaurant at 6 in the morning, And I asked the waitress if I could have a mimosa to kind of take the edge off, hair of the dog. And the waitress was like, well, I can't really open the bottle of champagne for you unless you're planning to drink the whole thing, because it's going to go flat before any of the other guests arrive. It's so early. And I was like, oh, never drink the whole thing. Yeah, whatever. Of course not. She's like, but I could give you like a vodka orange juice, which is a screwdriver. And in my mind, that was one of those little lines that I'd never crossed. Like this idea of hard alcohol at 6 a.m. was just one of those things. I was like, I'm not that person, quote, that person. But I was really desperate, and I knew I had this long flight home, and I was like, okay, I just have to get myself to the airport. I just have to get myself home. I had such a bad headache, such a bad hangover. And so I was like, okay. And I had a few of those before I left. And I arrive at the airport, and I just realized that I was bringing home the worst of myself, to my husband and my kids. And they didn't deserve that. They deserved much better from me. And it was this really humbling moment. And in that moment, something very unique happened, in the sense that instead of doing what I'd always done, which is beat myself up and spiral down into this place of guilt and shame and blame, I just kind of had this new question pop into my head. And I was like, why is it different? Why did I used to be able to take it or leave it and it was no big deal? Why did I used to like not even care about drinking, and now things are so painful? Why is it different? And I made a commitment to myself. Actually, I made two commitments to myself in that moment. Number one was that I was going to stop beating myself up about my drinking. I was going to get off this cycle of shame and blame, and then trying to make rules and breaking the rules and shame and blame that was just pulling me deeper and having me lose all trust and respect for myself. And number two was that I was going to answer that question. I was going to find out why. And so that really kicked off. I in essence, stopped trying to stop drinking. I put myself in what we call the pause in this Naked Mind Institute speak. And I really said, okay, you know what? I'm going to let myself off the hook completely and entirely, because I don't need that noise. I'm going to quiet the noise in my mind, and I'm just going to answer this question. And so that entered a year long of research of me. I wrote down every single reason I drank, had this huge long list, asked other people why they drank, and I started just going through them very methodically. Like, okay, does it relax me? And I'd look into the science, and I'd look into what it does in the brain, and I look into, the health aspects, and I'd come up with all this surprising, mind-blowing information about, no, it actually releases cortisol, which is the stress hormone. No, it actually creates like an adrenal experience, which is the opposite of relaxation. And little by little, all of my reasons that I gave myself of the reasons I was pouring a drink didn't hold up. And the truth is that we don't do something unless we believe it provides a benefit. And so by unwinding every single benefit, by the end of the year, I remember walking out of my office and telling my husband, like, you know what, if you want to get drunk with me again, tonight's the night, because after this, I think I'm done drinking. And he was like, whatever. He didn't believe me at all. But we shared a bottle of wine, and then that was really it. And it was like, that was almost 6 years ago now. And it's just been, I think, almost effortless in a way, because my feeling about alcohol went from, oh, I don't get to drink, to, oh my gosh, I never have to put that in my body again. I never have to choose to ingest that. Like, thank goodness. And so my emotions around it have just been so good and so positive. And I took all of that research. It was really messy, and I just put it out for a free download on a website in a PDF, and 20,000 people downloaded it in just a few weeks. And I started getting letters from all over the world like, hey, you should make this a book. I was like, okay, how do I do that? And so that kind of kicked off the process to writing the book, and then everything that's been built since.
Yeah, it's such an amazing story. And when I listen to you talk, I've said this to you before, your story is just so, in so many ways, parallels mine. Practicing law, really even the age 26, when it all kicked off for you. That's how old I was when I started articling at the firm I worked at. And just that the whole corporate environment, and how much of a role alcohol played in that, and how I really felt like, whether it was right or not, I felt like it was part of my job. And so whenever you tell that story, it always just brings back all these memories I have about my own experiences in drinking, and geez, I wish I'd gotten to the place you got to, but I'm glad you got to it at, and I was able to discover it through this naked mind, because that's really the magic behind this naked mind, is that dismantling of all of those beliefs that we have around why we think we need to drink. And it's just incredible. So I know I'm not the only one. There are probably hundreds of thousands of people out there who are so thankful that you wrote that book. It's such a cool story about how you got there. As I'm listening to you too, though, Annie, because I'm a burnout coach, in my mind, as I listen to your story, and because I went through my own burnout, which at the time I didn't realize it was burnout, never crossed my mind that was what was going on. But when I listen to you talk, you're trying to balance a family, this like obviously incredibly busy and crazy career, along with all the travel and that kind of thing. And we know from, all of everything we know about burnout, that one of the key signs of burnout is when people start to rely on an unhealthy coping mechanism too much, like alcohol or food or social media, to try to escape their life. And so when I hear your story, I think myself, like the red flags go off around burnout. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah. So a funny just side note of the story. I don't know that I've even ever told this part publicly before, but this was pretty soon before I stopped drinking. I'd say it was within maybe months, but I don't know, maybe it was a year or so. Anyway, it doesn't really matter the exact timeline. Suffice it to say, what happened was I had just gotten this global job, and I had to go meet as many of my new country managers as I could. So the company bought me around the world ticket. So I started in New York, went to Sydney, then Auckland, New Zealand, then Tokyo, then Shanghai, then Beijing, then Paris, then London, then home in 17 days. Anyway, I slammed my finger in a door in an elevator in Shanghai, and it just like did what fingers do. It got all purple and it was kind of hurting and kind of throbbing. And then about 3 days later, after how the trip was orchestrated was that I was in business class so that I could sleep on the flights in between the city visits. And so 3 days later, and like no hotels later, I arrive in Paris, and I was finally staying overnight in Paris in a proper like hotel place to stay. And I'm looking at my finger. I wake up in the middle of the night, I'm looking at my finger, and I become absolutely convinced that I have some sort of like disastrous disease, and my finger is just going to fall off. And so at 3 a.m, I freak out. I figure out how to get into a cab, how to communicate in enough French to get myself to an emergency room at a hospital about this finger situation. I check in, it's an American doctor, and she, after doing all the stuff, looking at everything, she looks at me and she's like, do you know that, she asked me a few questions about what I'd been doing, and then she starts to tell me about how like what I am doing is literally psychological torture, and that nothing is wrong with my finger. What I really just need is some sleep. Like I'm at the point of hallucinating. And so she sends me home with like a Xanax and a sleeping pill, and just like, you have got to make a change. And it's funny because I do think messages come, in whispers, and then in yells and shouts, and then upside the head. And looking at that in hindsight, I'm like, yeah, that was a pretty clear sign that something was really off the rails with my work-life balance.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's not great, but it's a great example of what happens when people are in burnout. You just lose your perspective on things, and that anxiety just starts to ratchet up. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, which is just something that I discovered really through, I mean, I think I knew it, but not at the level that it really kind of sunk in for me in terms of its connection to burnout. But just this, burnout is really just it's chronic stress. It's a elongated period of chronic stress that just takes us down. And most of the people that I work with are women, and most of them are trying to balance, a busy work life with a family, and all the responsibilities that go with each of those things. And as a result of that, the cortisol is just like, it just goes up, which is our stress hormone along with adrenaline. But cortisol is the one that, when it goes unchecked, when it's up for too long, it becomes really, really damaging. And it was always pretty obvious to me that alcohol didn't help with burnout. But what I didn't really make the connection until I did the certification program with you was that alcohol actually raises cortisol. So it's actually a contributing factor to burnout. It's not only a coping mechanism that we use in burnout, but that it then just exacerbates all of the symptoms of burnout because of what it does with cortisol. Can you just explain what the connection is between alcohol and cortisol?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to further confirm that I was firmly in burnout, I actually did do some blood test and saliva tests with a naturopath, and my cortisol levels were like 4 times. I should do it again because I'm very curious. I don't think it would be anywhere near that now because I feel like I've gotten a handle on things. But so when you drink, your body basically, the bottom line is that it wants to maintain homeostasis. So when something comes into the body that it sees as an intruder or is going to throw you off balance, it does everything it can to either purge the intruder. So like, if a virus comes in, all sorts of reactions start to happen to expunge the virus. Equally, alcohol, the body recognizes it as poison. That's just the reality. I'm not trying to like preach it to anybody, but it's just what it is. It's ethanol. It's the same thing that's in our gas tank. And so the body really tries to kick off different things to get it out of our system and to process it as quickly as possible. We actually know this as tolerance because our body becomes more and more efficient at processing alcohol and getting it out of our system. We feel the alcohol effects less and less as we drink more and more. So it's really like our body is creating this immunity to alcohol. But the other thing that it does in order to restore balance in the body is it compensates for what the chemical is doing. So in the case of alcohol is a really unique chemical in the case that it's both a stimulant and a depressant. So its stimulant nature happens when your blood alcohol is rising, and that's what gives you that fun kind of tipsy feeling for about 20 minutes. And then it's a depressant as soon as your blood alcohol kind of peaks and starts to fall. And that moment happens sooner and sooner when you're more and more tolerant. So the body says, okay, I see what's happening. I'm going to go to the expunge, get it out sooner than I would have before because I'm learning this process. Now, the problem is when it's starting to fall, it's a depressant. And by being a depressant, your body actually tries to balance that by releasing stimulants in the form of adrenaline and cortisol. So it is constantly trying to rebalance your natural homeostasis. I mean, the brain and the body have to be in such, if you think about it, like our temperature, it needs to be pretty much at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. There's not a lot of leeway there. Any lower or any higher is a really bad thing. And that's the same with the different sort of substance and chemical levels in the brain, even more so. There's probably less flexibility. And so if you put something in your body that is a depressant and is going to depress certain parts of your brain is going to say, oh my gosh, we need to bring that back up to normal. And so it does that by releasing adrenaline and cortisol. And it's just a really predictable way that alcohol is like contributing to that over delivery of those two hormones.
Yeah. It was just such a like light bulb moment for me when I realized that. I just, as I said, it's obvious that it doesn't help with burnout, but I just had no idea how it was physically connected to the root cause of burnout, which is really that just chronically elevated cortisol and that chronic stress condition. So thank you for sharing that. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about, Annie, is I'm going to just jump all over the place because we only have so much time and I'm bound and determined to max it out. So one of the things that I've talked to you about before is that one of the reasons why I think I stayed in drinking patterns for so long was because I did not identify as an alcoholic and I didn't meet the classic definition of an alcoholic. And when I did, there's some online tests you can take. And every time I did the online tests, I failed the online test and that I was not an alcoholic. And unfortunately, I think what that did for me was just just gave me a reason to keep drinking for longer because I felt like it wasn't bad enough. And I would love it if you would just kind of give us your take on that label of alcoholic and whether it's a helpful thing or not for most of us.
So I had a very similar experience in that I actually had a friend go to AA. She came to my house one day after, we were just drinking buddies, and among other things, we'd known each other for a long time. And she came to my house and she's like, all right, you guys, I'm not drinking anymore. I went to AA. And I said, oh, well, what does that mean about my drinking? And she goes, oh, Annie, I learned that I'm an alcoholic. I was born this way. You're not. And so for me, that put me very firmly in what we now would call the gray area of, okay, well, I don't fit in there. And actually, when I first wrote This Naked Mind and I published it on Amazon, I started to get reviews that said, oh, well, she's not a real alcoholic. And so there was some kind of phantom criteria that I didn't meet. She doesn't drink alcoholically. And so I've asked like a lot of people about, well, what does that mean? And there's all sorts of different answers. But, I looked into it from just a purely medical and scientific diagnostic perspective, and it doesn't exist as a diagnosis, right? So the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it actually talks about alcohol use disorder, which is much more usable because it talks about a spectrum of use. And that spectrum, interestingly, is based on a series of questions. And if you answer 1 or 2 in the positive, you have, mild. If it's 3 or 4, you have moderate. If it's more than that, you may have more severe. But it really takes into account that there are different areas in this. And when I don't think we take that into account, we either do one of 2 things. We avoid getting help, similar to you and I, because we were told, oh, well, that doesn't fit us, or we're afraid of getting help, because I've heard stories of people walking into meetings talking about their drinking and basically being told you don't belong here. Or we use it as just an excuse for, okay, well, I guess I'll just keep drinking because, I guess I'm not that bad. And none of those outcomes get us closer to where we want to be, which is really, in my opinion, rather than, even being sober, it's about finding peace and freedom in your relationship with alcohol, kind of whatever that means for you. For a lot of people, that does end up meaning that they decide never to drink again, but it doesn't have to mean that for everybody. And the whole idea of alcoholic doesn't allow room for that either. It's this very much like 100% is success and 99.9% is failure. And if you think about other things, we don't measure other things like that. Like, if you have 100 alcohol-free days and then you have 1 slip, in this world, you've had a relapse, and that's highly stigmatized. And, there's all sorts of negative things. You lose your chip, stuff like that. But in the real world, like if I was, starting to become a runner and I ran for 100 days straight and then I missed 1 day, I would still be a runner. Like nothing would have been lost. My 99 days would not have been lost. And I think that that intense black and white nature, there's actually a scientific phenomenon, and it has the kind of hilarious term of the what the hell effect, which basically means that once if the stakes are really high, for instance, say that you're on a diet and then you have just made so much pressure around this diet, and then all of a sudden you eat some cookie dough, you're going to say, what the hell, and eat the entire bowl of cookie dough. And this happens all the time with drinking, of people have these like, oh my gosh, like if I have 1 drink, I'm going to have to confess it to my, to my meetings, and I'm going to lose my chip, and I'm going to be in a situation with my friends and family where, I've made them all these promises. And ultimately, so one drink doesn't just stay 1 drink. In most cases, it turns into a 3 or 4 day bender, because what the hell? And by the way, to drown the shame and pain. And I really believe, and really good science shows, that compassion-based change is actually the most effective and long-lasting. Yeah. And when we're trying to change based on guilt or fear, we aren't as successful. And so I think that, part of the term alcoholic in general, it is something, I've heard it said, and I'm sure you have too, but be so careful of what you say after the word I am. Because it really does define you at a psychological level. It imprints on your subconscious. And admittedly, for some people, to say I am an alcoholic is what keeps them safe and sober. And I've had a friend who really explained this to me, and she said, you know what, Annie, this is what keeps me from drinking, because I know as an alcoholic, 1 drink will kill me. Now, is that actually true? Maybe, maybe not, but her belief in that sense keeps her sober. And so she is going to stick to that, because that I am alcoholic for her is where she finds her safety net. But for a lot of people, the I am an alcoholic is such a huge barrier to enter into the conversation. So instead of just saying, hey, would my life be a little bit better if I drank a bit less alcohol, we are having to, overcome this humongous barrier of saying, declaring this sickness that is, according to Alcoholics Anonymous, not curable, and you'll have for the rest of your life. And you have to make all of these lifestyle changes in order to overcome it. And so I think that while it might be helping the people who are actually willing and able to overcome that barrier and to walk into those meetings, it prevents so many people from ever taking that first step, because just quite frankly, to put it in the easiest way I know how, the barrier to entry into the conversation is too high. And I think one of the main reasons it's too high is because of the word alcoholic.
Yeah, I thank you. That was so well put. I feel exactly the same way. Um, and I love your comments about the importance of the grace-led approach and what happens when we are, when it's all resting on this one moment, and that whole what the hell effect takes place. That's something that I've been using around food for years and years. With all my clients who are listening right now are like saying, they're nodding their heads and saying, I've heard her say that before. I always say it's not the one meal or the one day or the one vacation. It's like what you say to yourself afterwards. Like that's the piece that really matters when it comes to making change. So that was one of the things that really resonated with me when I listened to This Naked Mind the first time. And I should just remind people, because I haven't really talked a lot about this on this podcast. I've been focusing on some other things, but I tried to moderate for years and years and years. I tried to come up with rules for myself, just like Annie did. Wasn't successful in that ever, and really just tortured myself, probably needlessly now in hindsight, for several years doing that. And then I think just at the absolute most serendipitous time, I listened to This Naked Mind, and everything changed in my brain in terms of how I thought about alcohol. And one of the things that was so amazing was that I felt like I had, like it was available to me to say, maybe I shouldn't drink. Maybe, and it was also available to me to consider the fact for the first time ever that my life without alcohol might actually be better. And that was something I had not contemplated before. So, those are all the things, like there's so many things I love about This Naked Mind, but those are some of the key things that you were talking about there. And I think the concept of rock bottom is kind of the same. That whole concept of like having to hit rock bottom. And I talk a lot about these high bottom moments that I had that I can think about. And when I'm working, I work largely with women in the gray area part of that spectrum. And most of them haven't had rock bottoms either. Most of them have had what they would consider to be high bottom moments, but not something that objectively society would see as a rock bottom. And it's really frustrating to me that you have to be able to justify your decision not to drink by referring back to something that objectively looks bad enough. And so I loved it. We had a conversation a long time ago now where we talked about this whole idea of like, really the question isn't, is it bad enough? The question is it good enough? And I just think that's the best way to put this question. So if you're listening to this podcast right now and you've been thinking about your relationship with alcohol, ask yourself that question, is this good enough? Could it be better? And I was just responding to a question today, actually, in the live alcohol experiment. And just someone was struggling a little bit. And I was saying, like, it's not about committing to not drinking for the rest of your life. All you need to commit to is just to give yourself the opportunity to find out whether it might be better if it wasn't around, right? And on that note, I would love for you to talk about that experiment mindset, because we talked about the 30-day experiment book that you have, which is amazing. And one of the other things I love about Annie is that she has always offered the free 30-day alcohol experiment online. And I did that free experiment after I read the book. And it was just a key piece to me changing a lot of my beliefs around alcohol. And what it calls for is this, like I just said, it's really about changing your perspective and your mindset around alcohol. So can you talk about why that experiment mindset is so valuable?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that if I kind of had to put it, in sort of a sentence, like what I want to affect in the world by any grace and means that I can, I would love to be part of the movement that makes the drinking conversation a wellness conversation rather than an addiction conversation, and basically backing up the conversation. If you imagine, like, we have rock bottom at one end of the spectrum, and then we have the person who just drinks occasionally, like maybe once a year at a wedding, at the other end of the spectrum. Society has kind of programmed us that in order to even question your drinking, you need to be flirting with it being bad. When I stopped drinking, almost 6 years ago now, I remember I got a text from one girlfriend in particular who knew me really well and had drank with me plenty of times. But she said, wow, I'm just really curious, like maybe we can talk about it sometime, but what must have happened for you to make this change? Like the assumption was that something had to go really, really wrong. Otherwise, why would anybody change their drinking? And I would love to see a society where, what are we talking about? Oh, we're talking about plant-based diets, and we're talking about, oh, taking a break from drinking, and we're talking about meditation, and we're talking about exercise, and all of these things are just part of this collective wellness conversation, as they should be. Because when I have met people who really have made a change at that end of the spectrum, not only is the change easier to make, but the benefits, like you just get so much out of it, because you're not like, you're not going into it with this sense of, oh, poor me, now I have to do this because I've kind of lost my drinking privilege by over drinking. It becomes really an empowered choice. And I think that's available to anybody, no matter how much they're drinking. It's changing our mindset to where it becomes a really empowered choice. But I think in order to do that, we have to stop talking about sobriety being the end goal. And I don't think that, I mean, I know it's a bit controversial, especially in the recovery circles, but I wouldn't say that that needs to be the end goal. I think that really the goal should be peace and freedom. How much of your day are you spending thinking about drinking or not thinking about drinking? For me, when I was drinking a lot, I was spending my mornings regretting my drinking, and so beating myself up for it. And then I was spending the middle of my day kind of being like, not today, not today, not today. And then I was spending like 3-4 p.m. like, okay, well, maybe just one, I think I can do that. And then I was spending like my first 2 drinks thinking, okay, this is going to be it. And then I was pretty much, obliterated for the rest of the night, and then waking up and repeating the cycle. So the number of like thoughts that I had in my head. And then this is true if you're trying to change any behavior in your life, whether it's like, food or social media. But if I could just be at a place where, because I thought I had to get sober if I wanted to do anything about it, and that was such a terrifying fact, because the people who I knew who were sober didn't make it look all that great. It again was this really big barrier to entry. And so I want to offer an alternative that says, like, let's just experiment. Like, don't think about this forever, all or nothing thing. Like, put that out of your mind. That is creating so much pressure. And by the way, we don't do it when we decide to become like, join a gym. We don't say, oh, well, the only way I'm going to join a gym is if I commit to going to the gym every day for the rest of my life. We just say, I wonder how this gym will be. Let me try it out and see if it makes me feel better. And then if it doesn't, we move on to the next thing. But we're not even allowing ourselves the opening to the conversation by framing it in terms of this all or nothing thinking, which, by the way, when are you going to know, if I promise you right now, Wendy, that I'm never going to drink again, when am I going to know I'm successful? When I'm dead. I will never actually know that I reached that goal. And so, I mean, I think that how the human mind works, things like that, they do one thing really well, and that's put a ton of pressure on us. So I actually don't say I'm never going to drink again. I say, I drink as much as I want whenever I want. And I haven't actually wanted a drink in almost 6 years now. And that for me feels like freedom. And that's what I invite people into, is an experiment to see if life would be better without predetermining the outcome.
Yeah, and I love that. And that's what the 30-day alcohol experiment is all about, guys. So if you're listening to this, the book is great. And the book now has this really awesome journaling component to it that wasn't there in the last print of the book, which is great, so that you can actually kind of do, because one of the things we talk a lot about in This Naked Mind is this idea of reducing the cognitive dissonance in your mind around alcohol, which means basically taking all of these kind of deep-rooted beliefs that you have around the things that alcohol does for you and kind of putting those to the test and working your way through the evidence on those. And the journaling function is a component of the experiment, is just such a big piece of that. So I think it's so great that it's in there. As I said, the alcohol experiment is always free. You can always take the free alcohol experiment. And then also there are these great live alcohol experiments that run regularly now as well. Thanks for that explanation. I mean, I think that that idea of just like giving yourself permission not to commit to a life, when I took the experiment, I was like, I'm just going to do this for a month. I mean, I was at the point, I say this all the time in my practice, and I probably said it already 20 times in these podcast episodes, but I was at the point where I was like, whatever I'm doing is not working. It is time to stop trying harder and start trying something different. And
Yeah.
that is really what This Naked Mind did for me. And I think it does for so many people, is it just provides a different way of trying to approach the problem. And it is very freeing when you don't have to commit. I didn't commit to anything. I'm still not really committed to anything, but it took me 18 months before I was able to say, yeah, I don't actually think I'm going to drink again. Probably not. But for the first 18 months, I was like, yeah, I don't know, not this month. But that's about all I could do. So, and that's the approach that I use when I'm coaching clients around this as well. So I want to talk a little bit about the pandemic and just the connection between the pandemic and burnout rates. And, just all of it is just such a tough time, especially, it's tough for everybody, but it's especially tough for women right now, because we are trying to manage, we've got like not just the first shift and the second shift, we've got like a third shift and sometimes a fourth shift in terms of the responsibilities that we have and the amount of stress and anxiety that we have. And I know there was a recent study done in Canada, and I think a very similar study that just came out in the States, around the relationship between this pandemic and increasing anxiety for women and increased reliance on alcohol as well.
Yeah. And
Go ahead.
I think that it's so interesting because I feel like with the pandemic, I mean, there's so much to talk about here, but two key things come to mind. And the first one is we all have mechanisms that we use to fill our needs, right? So if we have these needs as human, the need to feel loved, the need to feel connected, the need to feel like things are predictable and certain, the need for variety, all of these needs, right? And we get all of these needs filled. And often that was by driving to a job or meeting up with friends or going to the gym. And one of the things the pandemic did is it took all of those external mechanisms to fill them and it took them away. And so people had only a few things left, and alcohol, I would say, fills most of our needs, like on a very surface level and an artificial level, but it can fill the need for, overcoming loneliness, and it can fill all of these sorts of needs, but it doesn't do it over the long term. And so what we actually saw at This Naked Mind was really fascinating. It was like when quarantine first happened, it was almost like crickets. Like people who had been making some progress, questioning their drinking or thinking about where they wanted to be with alcohol, kind of like stopped talking. And then people like who were starting to do it were like, and everybody was just kind of in this hunker down survival mode of like, you know what, I'm going to do what I need to do. And I know this in my own life. I started making like cobblers and cookies and stuff all the time, and hunkering down, baking with my kids, just whatever to just kind of get through it, right? And I'd say about 6-7 weeks after quarantine started, we started just blowing up in terms of people who are coming towards us, because what happened was we think in the back of our mind, like, oh, well, alcohol is just like for happy hours after work, or it's just for this, or it's just for that. And then when you start using it all day, every day, and kind of take your guardrails off of it, you realize really quickly that it isn't doing what you'd hoped it would do. And so you're like, oh, crap. And so then I think we had the largest alcohol experiments ever, because people just had a complete reframe. And I think the other big thing about it is, something like the pandemic, like it exposes the cracks. And I think that can be like the stress points, right? So if you imagine like the human as the bridge, and we all can take a certain amount of weight and pressure. And burnout is obviously something that we do to kind of fortify ourselves. We start to reach out to these external coping mechanisms, and we're starting to like prop up our bridge when we feel like we're kind of cracking under the pressure. Something like the pandemic just adds so much weight that like it just shows all the stress points. And I think that can be really scary, but I would also just say that like, let's celebrate that in terms of awareness, because you can't change anything you can't see. And so even if your stress points were hidden, the places where you need to take better care of yourself, where you need to start getting really serious about like eliminating hurry and rush in your life, when you need to like start prioritizing things, even if it's scary, all of those things aren't even on your radar until something happens that exposes the stress points. And so awareness is always terrifying, but it's always really positive, because once we're aware of it, we can change it, we can do something about it. And I think that's one of the gifts really of the pandemic. But it's absolutely true. It is affecting, women I saw something that women were doing 17 times as much work as they were doing pre-pandemic, which I don't know if that's entirely true, but I could see, because little things like, maybe you were doing, maybe you had a housekeeper coming in on occasion and then they couldn't come in, or maybe you had daycare and now you can't send your kids and now you're homeschooling. And so, yeah, it's really intense, but it is giving us a gift in saying, okay, well, in order to live at this level of intensity, then what else do I need to, start to look at, and where can I heal that? And so we can't heal what we can't see, I guess, is the bottom line.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think that's totally true. And I actually, one of the studies, I can't remember whether it was the Canadian one or the American one, actually said that there was just this massive spike in March and April, like that. So what you're talking about in terms of what you saw at This Naked Mind is what's reflected in the data, in terms of people just kind of jumping into alcohol as the escape mechanism in those first two like really rough months where we were all just panicking and didn't know what was going on. So I guess my question for you is, there will be people listening to this podcast, I'm sure, who have noticed a change in terms of how they're using alcohol over the course of the pandemic, and who probably are feeling the way I was 3 years ago. And they're like, I don't know how to change this. I don't know what to do. What advice would you give somebody who's starting to notice that maybe alcohol is taking a little more than it's giving?
Yeah, the number one thing I think is the key to unlocking any conversation around this is curiosity without judgment. So often, especially when it comes to habits we may not like, or we may think are taking more than they're giving, and have may drifted into that sort of a little bit shameful for us to really have a conversation about. We get very judgmental of ourselves, and then we prevent curiosity because we just don't want to go there. We don't want to know. And I mean, look at my example that I gave early on of I stopped buying bottles of wine to buy the box because I didn't just want to know how much I was drinking. I wanted to obscure that from myself. And anytime you want to obscure something from yourself or anyone else, that's an indicator that there is some shame there. And so I would say, just like, just understand that as a human being, in this point in history, with all of the tools available to us as a society, and by the way, the massive amount of brainwashing and billions of dollars that are targeted at telling you that alcohol is the key to stress and intensity and socializing and all of these things, that you are really truly doing the best you can with the tools you have. And so, like, you should, I think, put down the blame and just get curious about what you're doing. And then when you start to get curious, one of the first things we do in the alcohol experiment, which Wendy said, it is always free. You can always find it at alcoholexperiment.com. But one of the first things we do is we teach you why your brain is actually doing exactly what it was intended to do. It is protecting you in terms of wanting to drink more. It is acting in accordance with its survival mechanisms, and there's nothing wrong with you. We have gotten this really screwed up and I think very harmful idea that there is a certain percentage of the population who can't drink normally, and they have a problem, and maybe it's a moral problem or a addictive personality problem or a self-control problem. Like, none of those things are actually true. And so if you're in a place where you are beating yourself up, I would say join it just to learn, even if you don't want to take a break, join it just to learn that your brain is doing exactly what it was meant to do all along. And there's nothing wrong with you. Alcohol is addictive because we have human bodies and flesh and blood and cells and brains. I mean, it's not addictive because you are just one of these random people who just can't keep it together. That is a very false story according to all the good science, and it's very detrimental. So yeah, curiosity without judgment, I think, is absolutely the gateway into this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's amazing, Annie. And I would say, just for everybody who's listening, I mean, I deal with all kinds of different habits that people start to overuse and aren't happy with anymore in terms of the balance in their lives, including food and social media. And the thing I love the most about This Naked Mind and the methodology is that it is so applicable to any area of your life where you're there's a behavior that you're engaging in more often than you want to, and it feels like things have gotten out of balance. And so I would say take exactly the same approach, because there are also like hundreds of thousands of people out there whose relationship with food has changed over the course of the pandemic, who are finding that they're eating way more sugar, for example, than they used to. And we know that, and social media is another huge one I hear about all the time. And the same thing happens in your brain with social media and with sugar, in terms of that, hit of dopamine and that rush that we get from it. And so if you're somebody who's thinking, well, it's not alcohol for me, it's food, or it's social media, or it's something else, then I would also really encourage you to get into that place of curiosity around it and just start to pay attention. Why is it? What are the patterns here? What are the triggers? What am I thinking? How am I feeling about this? And just give yourself the chance to experiment around it and see what's possible for you without it in your life. Thank you so much, Annie. Can I ask you one more question before you go?
Of course. Yeah.
I'm just curious about, as somebody who has, you've now agreed with me that you probably were in burnout, which I was nervous about suggesting to you. But as somebody who's been through it myself, and as somebody who's really worked now hard for the last 10 plus years, 12 years or so to balance, to really try to find a better balance in my life. And I am really busy in a job that I love, and I have 2 kids. But I feel like I'm starting to get there, and it's certainly something that I coach around all the time. I would love to know what you have learned about that since leaving your corporate job. And you're just incredibly busy, and now you had another child, I think, since you left.
Yep.
So you're super busy with your 3 kids. What have you learned about balance as a busy working mother?
So it's interesting. I think it's very different in corporate than it is in entrepreneurship, but I think some of the principles and foundational things are the same. I think, again, curiosity without judgment is really key. Like, when you're having an emotion of anxiety, when you're not wanting to go into work, when you feel like everything feels too heavy, instead of just judging yourself for it and forcing yourself to plow through it, get super curious about those emotions and kind of follow them and say, okay, what are you trying to tell me? So start to almost have a conversation with those emotions. And even if you can't do it in the moment, so say you're on a podcast like this and you just start to feel something. I actually keep a little journal that I call like emotional snags. And I just continuously like write down something that, okay, there's something there that I need to come back to. And sometimes it's just that I'm hungry, but sometimes it actually is something that's showing me, okay, there's a shift and a change that I need to make. And I think really tactically, one thing that I do very consistently that I find super helpful is I have the deep belief, especially when it comes to burnout, that often one of the reasons that we burn out is not necessarily whether the work is giving us energy or taking our energy away. So I work and balance, but I can do certain things at a much higher intensity than other things because I'm just wired. For instance, for me, writing and researching is something that I could do for a very long amount of time without experiencing burnout. Managing a system of, like repetitive nature is something that for me, if I have to do that very long at all, it's going to give me like, I'm going to be stressed about it. And then that stress is going to come into other areas of my life. So I just make a T chart and I call one side energy gain and one side energy drain. And I just every day or every week, I just add to it and reflect back on my day and say, what things did I do today that gave me energy and what things that I do today that drained my energy. So for instance, like a podcast interview gives me energy. Like I'm excited to do this. This will actually give me more energy for the things that I have to do later, right? Looking at a financial report is absolutely going to drain my energy. And so then as an entrepreneur, I have a goal that no matter the cost, I will get 2 or 3 of those energy drain things off my list every single month. And that is always evolving. And I think that is one of the things that really helps because you need to be careful of the hours in the day, but then I think you also need to be maybe equally even more careful of what you're doing with yourself in those hours. Because if you're doing things that give you tons of energy, then you're going to have all the energy you need for your kids when you get home. And the time you have with them can be totally filled up because you've got energy, or you're going to have all the energy you need to exercise because, you haven't I think burnout a lot can come when you've just dredged through your day, and then you're coming home and you feel like you just need to like lay on the couch because every single ounce of your energy has been sucked dry because you're doing something that you don't love doing. So I know that can be super scary. It can be super scary to take a really honest look at the things in your life that are draining your energy and just say, you know what, I'm not wired for that. I really like the idea of, so often we try to make a list of our weaknesses and we try to overcome our weaknesses and work on our weaknesses. And such a better use of our time is to mitigate our weaknesses. Don't try to get better at the things you're not naturally good at. That is a colossal waste of time. Don't do that. Mitigate them. Put somebody in place. Like if laundry drains your energy, stop doing your laundry. Literally tomorrow, there's somebody who would be happy to do your laundry for a really small amount of money, especially in this economy, right? But so just stop trying to force the things that drain your energy or that you're not wired for, you're not good at, and really double down on your strengths, on the things that light you up, because that is such a gift. The biggest gift you can give yourself and your family is your own happiness. And so often we just think we have to just push ourselves to do all the things because we think we should. And who said that you need to? Maybe cooking drains your energy. So there's lots of things you can do around that. And sometimes it's just thinking outside of the box, because maybe work lights you up and you love it, but you just have all this stuff at home. And so I think it's thinking about it really holistically and through both lenses of the hours in the day and through the lens of what you're doing in those hours.
Oh, I love that. That's such great advice. So in alignment with everything that I believe and teach and preach and all the rest of it. Thank you so much, Annie. This has just been such a great experience for me to have this opportunity to interview you. You're such an incredible force. And I just really appreciate everything that you're doing to just shine some light on our really complicated relationship as a society with alcohol. Before we end, where can people find out more about you and This Naked Mind?
So the main place, you can go to thisnakedmind.com, but I also just highly recommend, if you're curious at all, to check out the alcohol experiment at alcoholexperiment.com. It's always free, as we've talked about.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for giving us the time today, Annie. It's been such a treat to interview you. I really appreciate you.
Yeah. Thank you, Wendy. It was a pleasure.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a burnout and balance coach, I help busy high achievers like you create a more balanced, joyful life. To be sure you don't miss any upcoming bite-sized conversations, subscribe now to this podcast. For more balance and wellness tips or to connect with me, visit my website at wendymccallum.com. That's WENDYMCCALLUM.com.